I'm originally from Kingsport, Tennessee, which is a part of the Tri-Cities in the northeast part of the state. This photo is of my late grandfather's farm, which is now owned by my uncle, where I spent much of my childhood and adolescent years. My uncle built the barn and the log cabin by hand in the 80s and 90s. He had a wood shop in the basement of the cabin, and he would occasionally give me some scrap pieces of wood, a hammer, and nails, and just let me be creative. In elementary school, my classmates would be together playing kickball, while I was often found in a corner playing with dirt. My experiences like these as a child were the basis for my creativity. I was very fortunate to have gone to a high school with a fantastic visual arts program. Their course offerings included 2 levels of ceramics, 2 levels of drawing, fiber arts, lettering and design, and painting, and I enrolled in each of the classes offered. This was the first time I had worked with clay. I really excelled in the class, and I enjoyed working with it as a medium, but I did not realize at that point that it was what I wanted to do with my life. Around my junior year of high school, my best friend introduced me to Ella Fitzgerald's music. I had not really actively listened to music until my late teens, and this ultimately had a really big impact on my life. I really responded to hearing her flawless voice do things I never imagined to be humanly possible. There's also a fantastic documentary on Netflix right now on the life of Ella Fitzgerald, and it's really worth the watch. The following school year, I enrolled in the choir and was then offered a music scholarship to the University of Tennessee as a vocal performance major. The photo on the bottom is of me when I was about 4 years old with a microphone that I received for Christmas. It was difficult for me to acclimate from the transition of a high school of about 1,200 students to a university of 42,000 students. I also tested into the advanced music theory class, a class that I didn't belong in, and that kind of killed my urge to pursue music as a career. So the following year, I changed my major to psychology and worked on some of my general education requirements at a community college near my hometown. In the fall of 2004, my dad began a position as an associate professor of criminal justice at Virginia Intermont College, located in Bristol, Virginia. I transferred there that fall and continued studying psychology. And although I was very interested in the field, I was definitely not an A student. So I decided that maybe wasn't the route I should be going, and ultimately changed my major to art. I was lucky to have had a great art professor at Virginia Intermont. Dr. Marvin Tadlock taught ceramics, sculpture, 2D design, and 3D design, but his specialty is large-scale steel sculptures. I took a ceramics course there, but with it having been so long since I took it in high school, I had forgotten a lot about how to work the material, and so I got frustrated and I actually dropped the class. This photo shows Dr. Tadlock looking at one of his sculptures on the Virginia Intermont campus. Throughout my time at Virginia Intermont, I continued to work on my art electives, including life drawing, 2D design, and 3D design. Dr. Tadlock really taught me about using balance, repetition, tension, really all of the principles of design, and how to incorporate them into my work. I continued to study music through singing in choirs, performing in musicals, and taking voice lessons throughout college. And I also had a really serious Diet Coke addiction at the time. In 2007, we found out that Virginia Intermont College was on the verge of losing their accreditation. So my dad started teaching at Ferrum College in Ferrum, Virginia, and I took a year to study at Belmont University in Nashville to continue studying art with a music minor. But I really disliked living in the city, so I only stayed for a year and transferred to Ferrum College, where my dad was teaching. And this is an aerial photo of the Ferrum campus. That summer, I enrolled in a 2-week intensive ceramics course at Ferrum that included day-long workshops as well as field trips to Seagrove and to the Mint Museum in Charlotte. This image is from a series of 5-minute maquettes from that class. This project was just to get a feel for the material, loosen up, and basically work without really thinking about it. This is just a torn slab of clay with a crawl glaze, but these simple exercises became the basis for the spontaneity that I try to achieve when working on my sculptural forms. This was also the first time I had heard of wood-fired ceramics through a slideshow, and although I didn't know anything else about it other than the work being crusty brown pots, I knew that after having taken the course that ceramics was going to be what I concentrated on for the remainder of my education. The image on the right is a coil-built vase that I made that was fired in a small gas kiln at Ferrum during that workshop. And the image on the right is the work of one of the artists that we studied during the course, a wood-fired dog amphora by Kirk Mangus. After that course, I continued to enroll in additional art electives, including painting, drawing, black and white photography, and sculpture. Once I began focusing on ceramics, I started making a ton of work. My professor, Jeff Dalton, really got me to slow down and focus more on form and smoothness and paying attention to the little subtleties rather than producing more work, but that didn't stop me. In 2010, I started making a series of vessels that resembled the abstracted human form, along with carving concentric lines into white slip that followed the contours of the vessels. I made somewhere around 50 of these forms. As my forms progressed over the course of that year, they went from being vessels to more sculptural closed forms. This was the first piece that I had made as a closed sculpture. This is also when I began extensive testing with textural glaze recipes that I had been researching. This is a Cone 06 chartreuse moss glaze. It is finicky in that in order to achieve this result, I had to get the thickness of the glaze just right. And the previous slide shows the glaze with a thin application. This is a sculpture that I was particularly fond of, as I really liked the form, and the glaze turned out exactly how I wanted. In my last year of undergrad, I began looking at artists such as Henry Moore, Hans Arp, Barbara Hepworth, and ceramic artists Donna Pulsano and Kent Price. This sculpture was made out of high water clays Lyman red terracotta and a white slip, and the glaze is a Cone 04 lithium and strontium-based glaze with additions of copper and rutile. During my last year of undergrad, we had Eva Kwong come as a visiting artist, and I was really drawn to her work and her teaching methods. This form on the right was made during that workshop where she taught us how to use paper stencils and decorative slips. The photo on the right is from a 1985 episode of Mr. Rogers where Eva Kwong and her partner and husband, Kirk Mangus, were visiting artists on the show, and they remained lifelong friends. The top photograph here is of the Ferrum Art Club's trip to the Virginia Museum of Fine Art, where there was a June Kaneko exhibition. Seeing June's work in person for the first time really blew my mind in terms of what can be achieved with clay. The bottom photo is of the 3D art lab at Ferrum. This little 2-bedroom house was home to 3D design, sculpture, and ceramics. It ended up taking me 8 years to earn my bachelor's degree, and for a long time I regretted not having completed my degree sooner, for changing majors and schools, but in hindsight, I appreciate the amount of time that I spent. It helped me become the artist and person that I am, and it exposed me to a variety of educational institutions and teaching methods, something I would not have had going to one school. The liberal arts colleges that I attended in particular were especially beneficial in my becoming a well-rounded artist. After I graduated, I took a year off from school, but I couldn't stop making art. My former professor, Jeff, would occasionally let me sneak into the studio after hours just so I could keep my hands busy. One day, Jeff called and told me that Eva Kwong sent him a message asking if any of his students would be interested in going to graduate school at Kent State University. I had applied to 4 other graduate programs and was accepted to 3 of them. A few days after I applied to Kent, Kirk Mangus called me and said that he wanted me to come to Kent to study ceramics with a teaching assistantship. And this is one of Kirk's sketches of the Kent State University Ceramics Lab on a Jib Jab hot dog shop postcard. I started the graduate program at Kent State in the fall of 2012, and while I was a prolific maker in undergrad, I was still pretty green. I had never even fired a kiln before. About 2 weeks into my semester, I was teaching Intro to Ceramics, and I had to teach my students how to fire the raku kiln. And since I didn't have any work made yet, I decided to refire this piece. June, the studio technician, gave me a quick rundown on how to operate the kiln. I brought this piece with me to Kent, and I put some copper and iron-based glazes on the areas that were underfired. And while I hoped that it would turn blue, like the area around the eye, like I wanted and expected, it turned all black and metallic, and I think it really made the piece much more successful and poignant. These are some additional sculptures from the raku kiln at Kent with glazes I had researched and experimented with. The one on the left has a copper matte glaze brushed on with a thin application. The one in the center has a clear crackle with iron-rich slip underneath. And the one on the right has a copper and cobalt matte crawl glaze poured on. Shortly after I learned how to fire the raku kiln, I learned how to fire the salt kiln. This was one of my favorite kilns to fire at Kent. The sculpture shown was one of my first pieces made at Kent State, salt fired with Eva's Red Art Celadon, fired to cone 6. That fall, I was invited to participate in a wood firing at a former Kent professor's home nearby. Brinsley Tyrell is an emeritus sculpture faculty member. In the summer of 2012, he and his ceramic artist partner Megan decided to build a wood kiln on his property. They fired the kiln once before she received a job in California and moved. So Brinsley, being a phenomenal sculptor and artist in general, had never actually fired a wood kiln. So he decided to start inviting ceramic students to come over, and in return for firing his work, they could put their own work in the kiln as well. From left to right is Brinsley, my good friend Kabir, myself, June, our studio technician, and his wife. The other photo is of my dog Ella when she was 1 year old during the overnight shift of my second firing, and she is 10 years old now. Over the years, we had developed a wonderful wood fire community within Northeast Ohio, with new people coming to learn how to fire almost every firing. To date, there have been over 55 firings since 2012, and average about a firing every other month. The first kiln was a single chamber kiln based off of the Manabigama style fast fire kiln. However, it was not built on concrete, nor did it have any iron welded around it. So after 33 firings, it was time to tear it down and rebuild, as you can see from the looks of the arch in the picture on the right. This kiln took about 26 hours to fire and easily achieved cone 14. This was my first wood-fired sculpture fired in Brinsley's kiln. My first thought when we unloaded the kiln was, wow, This is a lot of work for brown pots. I really hated this piece, but I enjoyed the process so much, as well as the community aspect, that I continued firing. And these are some sculptures that were fired in that kiln. These first two images were made using high water clay's brownstone, which is actually a cone 6 stoneware that remarkably survives a short yet hot wood firing. This was made using a native Virginia clay that I had processed and wedged into another iron-rich stoneware. And this is the same clay body, but fired in the firebox underneath the grate, so it was more oxidized and didn't get quite as hot. This sculpture had a slip poured over, and then a Shino glaze poured over that, and then was fired on its side. And this one had a carbon trap Shino poured over and was fired in the back of Brinsley's kiln. Brinsley decided he wanted his new kiln to be similar to his old kiln, but bigger. In the fall of 2016, we ultimately started construction and made it into a 2-chamber grated tube kiln, with the back chamber designated for salt or soda firing. Backtracking just a tad to the summer of 2013, when I participated in my first wood firing at Kent State, where we fired the Onagama, affectionately nicknamed the Kirkagama. This kiln, as Kirk put it, was somewhere between an enigma and a pain in the ass, and it was. The results that came out of that kiln were either spectacular or absolutely miserable. This photograph was taken right after I completed loading the backstack in the kiln. The arch brick were all hand-wedged cone shapes and cemented into place, giving it this cave-like appearance. The undulation of the brick helped redirect and slow down the path of the flame, and when a lot of ash accumulated on the bricks, it would drip down onto pots. This is the last stack of the wares with one of my sculptures against the wall in the firebox. And this image was taken right after we unloaded that firing. I had finally found the type of surface treatment that I had been looking for in my work through researching textural glazes, and I realized that wood firing can be a lot more than brown pots. Around this time, I also began experimenting with a native Virginia clay from near the area where I was living and going to school. It's a very iron-rich clay containing various particle sizes of iron, mica, and sand, and it is incredibly refractory. It is not very plastic on its own, however, so I typically use it as an additive in slips, clay bodies, and glazes. These are examples of my first test tiles of the unprocessed clay fired in the Onagama. The one on the left was at cone 13 in the front, and the one on the right was around cone 8 in the back of the kiln. This is a clay body with my Virginia clay added to it, about a 50-50 mixture, and this was salt fired in the gas kiln at Kent and achieved a gunmetal-like appearance. This sculpture was made with the Virginia clay blended into another commercial stoneware, again about a 50-50 mix, and was fired in the middle front part of the Onagama at Kent State. This was the same clay body, but buried in the coals of the firebox of the Onagama, where it developed a moss-like surface where it was covered in ash. This sculpture has a slip made with the native clay and poured over it. As a slip, it can produce a range of colors from purple to yellow, greens, and blues. And these sculptures were made with a revised Malcolm Davis Shino glaze poured on. And I had revised the glaze to substitute red iron oxide with my Virginia clay because of the high iron content. And it turned out to be a really lovely glaze with a lot of variation. And these were fired in Brinsley's second kiln. These are a few additional works from the Kent State Onagama. Once I realized that the placement of the work in the kiln resulted in how they flashed, I became more methodical in my loading approach, making forms that either hug the arch or fit together in a way that limits the space the flame can travel through. This sculpture was fired in the firebox of the Onagama and developed a nice range of colors and surfaces. This was salt fired in the gas kiln, and it didn't really reach temperature. It was maybe around cone 3, and then it was refired by the side stoke port in the Onagama. In the fall of 2013, I had my MFA Candid to See exhibition. In graduate school, this is basically an exhibition to see if you are able to go on to complete your thesis exhibition. This was my installation, including a 5-foot-tall sculpture. In November of 2013, we got the news that Kirk Mangus had had an aneurysm while he was having a consultation for knee surgery, and he passed away just about a day later. This was the most devastating loss I had ever endured. I had only known him a little over a year, but the impact he had on me and countless other students was immense. He was by far the most prolific artist I had ever met, working in watercolors, pen and ink drawings, murals, wood-fired ceramics, terracotta, salt, and raku. He sculpted and made pots. He was constantly making, whether a finished work or a doodle, a poem, or drawing out tattoo ideas for students. This photo was of his last demonstration for us, making one of his classic ziggurat forms with 25 pounds of clay. During his last graduate seminar with us, he talked about how to write a thesis. He started off talking about Tyrannosaurus rex eating humans with tails, and then gravitated to the life of a mollusk. And after about 2 hours, he simply said, idea, form, content. Your exhibition is your thesis. And that was just his style of teaching. In the spring of 2014, I had my thesis exhibition titled Biomorphia. My work consisted of making sculptural forms that referenced abstracted bodies or parts of a body, animal-like forms, and natural forms. I incorporated a variety of surface treatments and firing techniques, including wood, raku, salt, and house paint. I consider this to be an ongoing, ever-changing series. After graduate school, I moved back home to Virginia for a year or two. I found a gallery and glass-blowing studio in town that had a ceramic studio, and I started working out of there and teaching classes. But I was in a funk, and I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do. All I knew was that I wanted to be firing wood kilns. I couldn't take it, so one fall I decided to do a pit firing. The pit that I dug was about 6 feet long by 4 feet wide and about 2 to 3 feet deep. And I didn't have any copper carbonate on hand to achieve a copper fuming effect, so I used Miracle Grow and some table salt. And these are some of the results from that firing. The 2 pieces on the left were made using my Virginia clay blend, while the one on the right was made with a cone 5 porcelain. In the spring of 2016, I moved back to Ohio. I was working a couple of part-time jobs and teaching a ceramics class, just enough to make ends meet and make work. This was right around the time when we rebuilt Brinsley's wood kiln. This kiln takes anywhere between 48 to 56 hours to fire, and we typically achieve cone 13 in the front, cone 9 or 10 in the back, and cone 10 or 11 in the salt chamber. Over the course of the past few years, I have continued working on my Biomorphia series. In addition to abstracting the human, animal, or nature-like elements, I am just as interested in the process. I want to capture the relationship I have with the material. It is exciting to push the line between balance and tension and seeing how far I can push the clay's limitations before it collapses. Wood, salt, and soda firing my work brings along its own set of challenges. And this piece was fired in the soda chamber in Brinsley's kiln. The sculptures like these, where it makes a kind of upward thrusting zigzag motion, are inspired from the trees that I see on my hikes near rivers, where a part of a tree will jut out of the ground toward the river and then bend backward and upwards in the opposite direction. The sculpture on the left was salt-fired with no glaze applied, whereas the one on the right had a yellow salt glaze poured over and was soda-fired. This sculpture was fired toward the top front of Brinsley's second kiln. These two sculptures were glazed with an orange and white Chino poured on, and I really loved that splash of orange on the face of the one on the right. And the one on the left developed a lot of really nice crystal growth in areas. These next couple of sculptures were made within the last year. This has my Malcolm Davis Chino glaze poured on and was salt fired. And this sculpture has my yellow salt glaze poured on and was also salt fired. This piece did not turn out the way that I was hoping for at first, so I decided to cold work it using metallic acrylic paints, and then sprayed a solution that oxidizes the copper or steel metal in the paint into a green copper or rust within a matter of minutes. There ended up being about 5 layers of paint on this piece that I had built up and sprayed down. I had previously been working for a ceramics supply company in Ohio for about 4 years before I came to this area in mid-July, beginning my position as a ceramic supply shop manager here at STARworks. Since I have been at STARworks, I have continued making a new body of work using these fantastic local clays. These next sculptures are what I've been working on since coming to STARworks. They are currently awaiting the bisque or the first firing. They are made using STARworks sculpture clay, which is what the visiting artists use to make the larger-than-life-size sculptures that are fired during Firefest. This sculpture was made using the STARworks sculpture clay and my Virginia clay slip poured over. Sometimes I like to revisit old forms. They may not have turned out exactly how I wanted, or sometimes I just feel drawn to a particular form and want to see how many iterations I can make of it before I feel like I have a successful piece. This was a reiteration of my first salt-fired sculpture, but about 4 times the size. Sometimes I can't figure out how I want to finish a piece that I've already started sculpting. This is when I usually do the most sketching. I will take a photograph of the sculpture in progress on my iPad and upload it to my sketchbook app. And then I trace the outline of the work, remove the photo, and then begin sketching different ideas to see what it could look like. And this is the completed piece. And here's another short time-lapse video of how I begin my larger coil-built sculptures. I begin by rolling out a slab of clay and then trace a shape that I think would make a nice base for the sculpture. In this instance, I drew a sort of curved teardrop or paisley shape. From there, I begin coiling upward and outward, blending the coils together and smoothing out with a serrated rib, a smooth, flexible rib, and then my fingers as I go, letting it stiffen up just enough to support the weight of additional coils. Once it is stiffened up a bit, I continue coiling until I am able to close in the form. This is usually when I coil build and attach the neck section, and then once I have finished building the main part of the sculpture, I pinch out little cone or hemisphere shapes and place them on the sculpture in a way that will not only tie the work together, but will also lead the viewer around the piece. This sculpture was made using STARworks Groggy Weemy. And these next few sculptures were made out of solid pieces of clay and are basically a continuation of my maquette exercises. These two were made with STARworks New Catawba. I start by roughing out the basic shapes with my hands, let them stiffen up to a hard leather hard, continue to rough out using a fettling knife or trimming tool, and then finally smooth out the shapes using a Sureform. I like to use the Mud Tools shredder tools because they have different shapes and sizes that help get into tight spaces. This sculpture was made in the same way using STARworks Dark Star. This one was made with Okiwimi. And this one was made with New Seagrove. And this is my most recent sculpture, having just finished building it on Tuesday. I'm excited to be firing this new body of work in our upcoming Noborigama firing here at STARworks next month. This is the longest period of time in 9 years that I've gone without wood firing, yet it has only been 6 months. I'm really looking forward to seeing how the kiln fires and learning from the information and results that come out of it. And you can keep up with my work via my website or through Instagram. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Do you visit everything, or do you ever single fire?
I have single fired in the past. In the Onagama at Kent State, I fired green pretty often. That one tall piece with the kind of green and yellow slip poured on, that was fired green. And my solid sculptures, sometimes I'll put them towards the back of the kiln on the floor, and they turn out great. All right.
When you make your sculpture, did you plan before you make something, or you started and then think about the form after you started?
I usually start with an idea, but usually the idea is planned in the slab for the base, and then I build on top of that and just take it as it goes. And that's where I really try to be a little more spontaneous with my building approach.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Ryan.
Thank you.